The people who change your life are rarely the ones you notice first. The first time I walked through the gates of the Moretti estate, I thought I was entering another world. The driveway alone seemed longer than the street where I grew up. Tall iron gates stood behind me while perfectly trimmed hedges stretched toward a mansion so large it barely looked real. I tightened my grip on my small suitcase and reminded myself why I was there. I needed the job. Simple as that. My name is Emily Carter. I was 23 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, and trying to build a future with more determination than opportunity. When a private employment agency offered me a position as a live-in maid at one of the most prestigious estates in New York, I accepted before fear had a chance to change my mind. The salary would help me pay off old bills and finally create some stability. At least that was the plan. A house manager named Mrs. Holloway greeted me at the entrance. She was elegant, organized, and efficient in a way that immediately made me stand straighter. "You will find that this house runs on routine," she said while leading me through marble hallways. "Learn the routine and everything becomes easier." I nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The estate felt endless. Crystal chandeliers reflected sunlight across polished floors. Massive windows overlooked acres of private land. Paintings lined the walls. Every room seemed larger than my entire apartment. Yet despite the luxury, the mansion felt strangely quiet. Almost lonely. During the next few days, I focused entirely on work. I cleaned guest rooms, organized storage areas, polished furniture, and learned the daily schedule. The staff treated me kindly enough, though everyone seemed careful about one subject. Damien Moretti. His name carried weight inside the house. Not fear exactly. Respect. Distance. Curiosity occasionally surfaced among the staff, but nobody spoke about him for long. I only saw him once during my first week. He crossed the main foyer while speaking on the phone. Tall. Confident. Impossibly composed. He wore a dark suit and moved with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to making important decisions. He never looked in my direction. In truth, I doubted he even noticed I existed. And that was perfectly fine with me. I preferred staying invisible. Invisible people made fewer mistakes. One rainy afternoon, while dusting shelves in a rarely used hallway, I paused beside a large window. The estate grounds disappeared beneath gray clouds and falling rain. Without thinking, I touched the old pocket watch hanging from a chain around my neck. It had belonged to my father. The only thing I had left from him. I barely remembered the man himself. He had died when I was young. Most of what I knew came from stories my mother used to tell. According to her, he was honest, hardworking, and stubborn enough to help strangers even when he had troubles of his own. I smiled faintly and tucked the watch back beneath my uniform. Then I returned to work. I had no way of knowing that a forgotten object hanging around my neck would soon connect my life to secrets buried for decades. At that moment, I was simply a maid trying to do her job well. And somewhere else inside the mansion, a man named Damien Moretti was about to discover that the past had quietly walked through his front door. By the second week, I had learned something important about the Moretti estate. The mansion looked busy, but most days moved with remarkable quiet. Staff members followed routines. Deliveries arrived on schedule. Meetings came and went behind closed doors. Everything operated with precision. I liked that. Predictability made life easier. It gave me something solid to hold on to. That morning, Mrs. Holloway assigned me to clean the private library on the east wing. I had passed the room before but never entered it. The moment I stepped inside, I stopped. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stretched across every wall. Dark wood paneling reflected warm light from tall windows overlooking the estate grounds. Leather chairs surrounded a stone fireplace. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished oak. It felt less like a library and more like a place where important memories were stored. I spent the first hour dusting shelves and organizing books that had been left on tables. The work was peaceful. Somewhere outside, light rain tapped softly against the windows. Occasionally, I paused to read the titles printed on old book spines. History, politics, philosophy, biographies. Surprised me. For some reason, I had imagined Damien Moretti as someone interested only in business. The library suggested something deeper. Around noon, I climbed a small ladder to reach a higher shelf. As I stretched forward to dust the top row, my sleeve caught the chain around my neck. Before I could react, the pocket watch slipped free. Time seemed to slow. The watch fell from beneath my uniform and struck the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic sound. My heart immediately dropped. I hurried down the ladder and picked it up. Relief flooded through me when I realized it was not damaged. The glass remained intact. The chain was fine. I exhaled slowly. You should be more careful with that. The voice behind me made me freeze. I turned around. Damien Moretti stood several feet away near the entrance. I had been so focused on my work that I never heard the door open. He wore a dark suit without a tie, and his expression revealed nothing. Calm, controlled, observant. I immediately straightened. I am sorry, sir. His eyes were not on me. They were on the pocket watch. Something changed. Very slightly. The kind of change most people would never notice. But I did. His attention narrowed. His expression hardened for a fraction of a second before becoming unreadable again. Where did you get that? He asked quietly. I looked down at the watch resting in my hand. It belonged to my father. The room suddenly felt different. Smaller somehow. Damien took a slow step forward. Your father. I nodded. It is the only thing I have from him. For several seconds he said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the watch. Not with curiosity. Recognition. The realization sent an unexpected chill through me. May I see it? He finally asked. I hesitated only briefly before handing it over. He accepted it carefully, almost respectfully. His fingers traced the worn metal surface. Then he opened the cover. The moment he saw the engraving inside, the color drained from his face. A long silence followed. I had never seen someone so composed look genuinely shaken. Damien stared at the inscription as though he had suddenly stepped backward in time. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Emily, he said slowly, what exactly do you know about your father? The question lingered in the air long after Damien spoke. For a moment I simply stared at him. The pocket watch rested in his hand, and whatever he had seen inside seemed to matter far more than I understood. Not much, I finally admitted. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. My father died when I was young. Damien remained completely still. How young? 7. He lowered his eyes briefly toward the engraving inside the watch. The silence that followed felt strangely heavy. What was his name? I hesitated. It was a simple question. Yet something about the way he asked it made my pulse quicken. Michael Carter. The reaction was immediate. Not dramatic. Not obvious. But undeniable. His fingers tightened slightly around the watch before he looked away toward the windows. The rain continued falling outside, tapping softly against the glass. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Damien carefully closed the watch and handed it back to me. Thank you. I accepted it slowly. Did you know him? The question escaped before I could stop it. Damien's gaze returned to mine. Calm again. Controlled. Yet something behind his eyes had changed. A long time ago, he said quietly, I knew someone with that name. Someone. Not my father. Not a friend. Just someone. The answer felt incomplete. Before I could ask anything else, he glanced toward the shelves behind me. You should finish your work. Then he turned and left the library. The door closed softly behind him. I stood frozen for several moments. The watch suddenly felt heavier around my neck. That evening, I could not stop thinking about the conversation. Every detail replayed in my mind. The way Damien recognized the watch. The expression on his face. The questions. Most of all, the silence after I mentioned my father's name. Something connected them. I was sure of it. Crossed the estate. Damien sat alone inside his private office. The rain had stopped hours earlier, but darkness still covered the grounds outside. A single desk lamp illuminated stacks of documents spread across polished wood. Yet his attention remained elsewhere. A name continued echoing through his thoughts. Michael Carter. 15 years had passed. 15 years since he had last heard that name spoken aloud. Slowly, Damien opened a locked drawer. Inside rested several old photographs, yellowed documents, and faded newspaper clippings. Objects most people would consider worthless. Objects he had never thrown away. He removed a photograph and stared at it. 3 men stood together beneath a summer sky many years earlier. One of them smiled directly at the camera. Michael Carter. Damien exhaled slowly. Time had changed many things. Faces aged. Memories faded. Entire lives moved forward. Yet some debts never disappeared. He reached for his phone. "Find everything you can about Emily Carter," he instructed quietly after the call connected. Family records. Education. Employment history. Everything. There was no anger in his voice. No suspicion. Only certainty. After ending the call, he returned his attention to the photograph. His gaze settled on Michael's face. "Where have you been all these years?" he whispered. Meanwhile, in my small room on the 3rd floor of the estate, I sat on the edge of the bed holding the pocket watch beneath the glow of a bedside lamp. I opened the cover and examined the engraving that had changed everything. The words looked exactly as they always had. Simple. Ordinary. Familiar. Yet now they seemed different. As though a hidden story existed between every letter. I traced the inscription with my thumb, and wondered the same question that would keep me awake long into the night. Who was Michael Carter really? The following morning felt unusually quiet. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the estate, casting long golden reflections across polished floors. Yet beneath the calm routine something had shifted. I felt it the moment I woke up. Perhaps it was the conversation in the library. Perhaps it was the way Damien reacted to my father's name. Whatever the reason, I could not shake the feeling that invisible pieces were moving somewhere beyond my sight. I spent the morning helping prepare guest rooms for an upcoming event. Fresh linens, arranged flowers, perfectly folded towels. Ordinary tasks. Familiar tasks. Yet every few minutes my thoughts drifted back to the pocket watch resting beneath my uniform. Around noon, Mrs. Holloway approached me with a new assignment. Mr. Moretti would like the West Archive Room organized. I blinked in surprise. The archive room? She nodded. Most staff rarely enter it. Follow the inventory list carefully. The West Archive occupied a quiet corner of the mansion's older wing. Unlike the elegant library, this room felt forgotten by time. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with boxes, ledgers, framed photographs, and decades of family records. Dust floated through beams of sunlight entering narrow windows. The air smelled faintly of paper and age. I spent several hours sorting documents and placing labels on storage boxes. The work was slow but strangely interesting. Every shelf seemed to contain fragments of lives long gone. Then something unexpected happened. While organizing a stack of old photograph albums, one slipped from the shelf. The album struck the floor and opened. Several photographs scattered across the hardwood. I immediately knelt to collect them. One image caught my attention. 3 men stood together beneath a bright summer sky. They appeared younger than anyone I recognized from the estate. One wore a baseball cap. Another smiled directly at the camera. The third stood with his arm resting casually across a friend's shoulder. Something about the photograph felt important. Familiar. My heart skipped. The smiling man looked remarkably similar to the face in an old photograph my mother once kept in a drawer. My fingers tightened around the image. Then I noticed writing on the back. Names. Damien Moretti. Anthony Russo. Michael Carter. The room suddenly felt very still. I read the names again. Michael Carter. My father. My breath caught. For several seconds I simply stared at the photograph. Confusion flooded my thoughts. Why would a picture of my father be stored inside the Moretti estate? Why had Damien looked so shocked when he saw the pocket watch? Why did it suddenly seem as though everyone knew something except me? Footsteps approached behind me. I quickly turned around. Damien stood in the doorway. His gaze immediately settled on the photograph in my hands. The expression on his face answered a question before words ever could. He knew exactly which photograph I had found. Neither of us spoke at first. Silence stretched between us. Then Damien crossed the room slowly. I was wondering when someone would find that. My pulse quickened. You knew my father. It was no longer a question. Damien lowered his eyes toward the photograph. For a moment he looked less like the powerful man who owned the estate, and more like someone remembering a different life entirely. Yes, he said quietly. I knew him. My heart pounded. Years of unanswered questions suddenly felt closer than ever. I looked down at the smiling face in the photograph. A man I barely remembered. A man who seemed connected to secrets hidden throughout this mansion. When I finally looked back up, Damien's expression had changed again. There was sadness there now. Regret. Gratitude. And something else. Something that made my pulse race. Emily, he said softly, there is a great deal about your father that you do not know. For several seconds neither of us moved. The old photograph remained between my fingers while Damien stood across from me in the archive room. Dust drifted through the sunlight. Somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion, life continued as normal. Yet inside that room everything felt different. My father's smiling face stared back at me from a picture that should never have existed inside the Moretti estate. What do you mean? I asked quietly. Damien's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Your father was not the man you think he was. The words settled heavily in the silence. I looked down at the image again. Michael Carter. The man my mother described as honest, hardworking, and ordinary. The man who fixed broken fences for neighbors and volunteered to help people whenever he could. There was nothing mysterious about him. At least that was what I had always believed. My mother never mentioned any connection to you, I said. Damien nodded slowly. I know. His expression darkened with memory. Because your father never wanted recognition. The answer only created more questions. Before I could ask another, Damien gently took the photograph and placed it on a nearby table. Then he crossed the room toward a locked cabinet hidden behind several storage boxes. I watched silently as he removed a small key from his pocket. The cabinet opened with a soft click. Inside sat a single weathered box. Unlike everything else in the archive, this box appeared carefully preserved. Protected. Important. Damien lifted it with both hands and carried it to the table. For a moment he simply stared at it. I have not opened this in years. My pulse quickened. What is it? He looked at me. Part of your father's legacy. The room suddenly felt smaller. Damien opened the lid. Inside rested old documents, photographs, and handwritten letters bundled together with fading ribbon. Time seemed frozen within the box. My eyes immediately settled on a photograph near the top. It showed my father standing beside several people outside what looked like a community center. Everyone was smiling. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were simple words. Thank you for helping us when nobody else would. I swallowed hard. Damien carefully removed another photograph. Then another. Each one revealed a different moment. Different people. Different years. Yet the pattern remained the same. My father appeared beside families, elderly neighbors, volunteers, and community workers. Not as a wealthy benefactor. Not as a public figure. Just as someone quietly helping where he could. What is all this? I whispered. Damien's expression softened. Proof. Proof of what? He picked up a folded letter and handed it to me. The paper had yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter came from a local youth center. It thanked Michael Carter for anonymously funding repairs after a severe storm damaged the building years ago. I stared at the words in disbelief. My father never had much money. At least that was what I had always been told. Yet another letter thanked him for helping a family keep their home during a financial crisis. Another described scholarships paid for children whose parents could not afford school supplies. I looked up at Damien. Why did nobody tell me any of this? His answer came quietly. Because your father never wanted anyone to know. The room fell silent again. Then Damien reached into the bottom of the box. His expression changed immediately. Whatever he found mattered more than everything else. Slowly he removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Emily. My breath caught. The world seemed to stop. Damien stared at the envelope for several seconds before handing it to me. Your father left that behind 15 years ago. My fingers closed around the paper. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. For me. Damien nodded. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. He said it should only be opened when the time was right. My hands trembled as I stared at the envelope. The archive room seemed impossibly quiet. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Old photographs and documents surrounded us. Yet my entire world had narrowed to a single piece of paper carrying my name, Emily, written in my father's handwriting. For a moment I could not move. 15 years separated me from the man who wrote those letters. 15 years of questions. 15 years of believing there was nothing left to discover. Yet somehow he had been waiting for me inside a forgotten box, hidden within the Moretti estate. Damien stood silently across from me. He did not rush me. He did not speak. He simply watched with an expression I could not fully understand. Respect. Sadness. Relief. Slowly I broke the seal. The paper inside unfolded with a soft crackle. My vision blurred almost immediately. Dear Emily. The word struck harder than I expected. Tears filled my eyes before I reached the second sentence. If you are reading this, then life has moved forward without me longer than I hoped it would. I swallowed hard and continued. I need you to know something before you learn anything else. I loved you every day of my life. No matter what stories you hear after this letter, never doubt that truth. My chest tightened painfully. Across the room, Damien lowered his gaze. I continued reading. There may come a day when people tell you I was important. Some may even tell you I changed lives. Do not measure a person by what others say about them. Measure them by how they treated people who could do nothing for them in return. Tears slipped down my cheeks. The handwriting remained steady throughout the letter. Calm. Certain. Familiar in a strange way. Every sentence felt like a conversation I never had the chance to experience. Then I reached a passage that changed everything. There is a man named Damien Moretti. If you ever meet him, listen carefully before you judge him. Life will tell many stories about him. Some true. Some false. But there is one thing I know with certainty. He keeps his promises. My eyes immediately lifted toward Damien. He remained motionless. Yet emotion flickered briefly across his face. I looked back down and continued reading. Years ago, I asked him to do something for me. I asked him to protect a future he could not see. I never knew whether that future would arrive. But if you are reading this letter, then perhaps it did. My pulse quickened. The room seemed smaller with every sentence. I turned the page. If the time is right, Damien will tell you the rest of the story. He carries part of it. I carry another part. The final part belongs to someone named Samuel Bennett. If he is still alive, find him. He knows truths that neither Damien nor I could fully explain. I blinked. Samuel Bennett. Another name. Another clue. Another piece of a puzzle stretching far beyond anything I imagined. When I reached the final paragraph, tears completely blurred the page. Emily, you do not inherit my money. You do not inherit my reputation. Those things disappear with time. What I hope you inherit is the belief that helping people matters. If you carry that forward, then everything I did was worth it. I lowered the letter slowly. Silence filled the archive room. For several moments, neither Damien nor I spoke. Finally, I looked up. Who is Samuel Bennett? Damien exhaled slowly. The expression on his face told me he had hoped that question would wait longer. Someone your father trusted. He paused. Someone I have not seen in 15 years. My heart began racing again, because I suddenly understood something important. The letter had answered questions, but it had also opened a new door. And somewhere beyond that door waited the truth my father had spent 15 years protecting. The following morning arrived beneath a gray sky. Low clouds drifted across the horizon while a cold wind moved through the trees surrounding the estate. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's letter. Every sentence echoed through my thoughts. The envelope now rested safely inside my room, yet it felt as though a part of him had finally returned after years of absence. Shortly after breakfast, Damien asked to see me. We met in a quiet sitting room overlooking the gardens. A fire burned softly inside the stone fireplace. Outside, winter had begun painting the landscape in pale shades of silver and white. Damien stood beside the window when I entered. He looked thoughtful, distant, like someone carrying memories he could no longer avoid. Did you sleep at all? He asked. I smiled faintly. Not much. He nodded as though he expected that answer. Then he handed me a small piece of paper. An address. Samuel Bennett lives here. I looked down at the handwritten location. A small town nearly 3 hours north of New York City. You found him. Damien turned toward the window again. It was not difficult. The way he said it suggested something else. Not relief. Hesitation. My pulse quickened. You do not seem happy about it. Silence lingered. Finally Damien spoke. Because once we find Samuel, there will be no more mysteries. I stared at him. Is that a bad thing? For the first time since I met him, Damien smiled sadly. Not always. The drive north began later that afternoon. Snow flurries drifted across the highway while miles of countryside unfolded beyond the windows. For long stretches, neither of us spoke. The farther we traveled from the city, the quieter everything became. Eventually, small towns replaced highways. Old storefronts appeared beside narrow roads. Church steeples rose above clusters of houses. The world felt slower here. Simpler. 3 hours later, we arrived at a modest farmhouse surrounded by bare trees and rolling fields. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A weathered pickup truck sat near the barn. The property looked ordinary, peaceful. Yet my heart pounded harder with every step toward the front porch. Damien knocked once. Footsteps sounded inside. The door opened. An older man stood before us. Gray hair. Deep lines around his eyes. The posture of someone who had spent years working outdoors. For several seconds he simply stared at me. Then everything changed. The color disappeared from his face. His eyes widened. One hand rose toward his mouth. No, he whispered. My pulse raced. Samuel looked as though he had seen a ghost. That cannot be possible. Damien remained silent beside me. Samuel never looked away from my face. Tears immediately filled his eyes. You look exactly like her. The words caught me completely off guard. Like who? Samuel blinked several times. Emotion overwhelmed him. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward Damien. In that moment I realized something important. He had expected this day. Maybe not today. Maybe not now. But eventually. Samuel stepped aside. Come in. The farmhouse felt warm and welcoming. Family photographs covered the walls. A grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. Yet nobody paid attention to any of it. We sat at a wooden kitchen table while Samuel struggled to compose himself. Finally he looked directly at me. Emily, he said quietly, your father was one of the best men I ever knew. My throat tightened. Samuel reached toward a nearby drawer and removed an old photograph. Then he slid it across the table. The moment I saw it, my breath stopped. Standing beside my father was a woman I had never seen before. Yet somehow she looked familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Samuel's voice barely rose above a whisper. That is your mother. For several seconds I could not breathe. My eyes remained fixed on the photograph resting on the kitchen table. The woman standing beside my father looked younger than I expected. She had bright eyes, a warm smile, and features that felt strangely familiar. Not because I had seen her before. Because every time I looked in a mirror, I saw pieces of her looking back at me. My hands trembled as I picked up the photograph. My mother. I whispered. Samuel nodded slowly. Emotion filled his eyes. Her name was Rebecca Hale. The room fell silent. All my life I believed my mother had died shortly after my father. That was the story I grew up hearing. A simple story. A painful story. Yet something about Samuel's expression told me there was far more beneath the surface. I looked toward Damien. He remained unusually quiet. Watching. Waiting. As though he already knew what came next. My pulse quickened. Why have I never seen this photograph before? Samuel exchanged a glance with Damien. Then he sighed heavily. Because your father wanted to protect you. The answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. Everyone seemed to be protecting me from something. Protect me from what? Samuel lowered his eyes briefly. When he looked back up, there was sadness in his expression. The truth. The word settled heavily across the table. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the farmhouse windows. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Samuel reached toward another drawer and removed a thin folder. The edges showed years of wear. He placed it carefully in front of me. Your father left this with me. My heart immediately began racing. Another secret. Another piece of a life I barely understood. I opened the folder. Inside rested letters, photographs, and official documents. One document immediately caught my attention. A newspaper article. The headline was simple: Community Leader Honored for Lifetime Service. Beneath the headline appeared a photograph of my father. I stared in disbelief. Community leader? Samuel nodded. Your father spent years helping people. I remembered the letters from the archive box, the scholarships, the donations, the families he helped. Yet every new detail seemed larger than the last. Why did nobody ever tell me any of this? Samuel smiled sadly. Because Michael never wanted attention. Lowered my eyes toward the article. My father looked happy, confident, respected, completely different from the ordinary man I had imagined throughout my childhood. Then I noticed something else. A second photograph attached to the article. My breath caught. Standing several feet behind my father was Damien. Younger. Smiling. Watching him with obvious admiration. Slowly I lifted my gaze. You looked up to him. Damien remained silent for several moments. Then he nodded. More than you know. The answer changed something. Until now, I believed my father and Damien simply knew each other. Suddenly, that explanation no longer felt sufficient. There was history here. Loyalty. Gratitude. A connection far deeper than friendship. Samuel leaned forward slightly. Your father changed a lot of lives, Emily. His voice softened. Including Damien's. The room became perfectly still. My pulse pounded in my ears. Finally, Samuel opened a small wooden box resting beside the folder. Inside lay a single cassette tape labeled in fading handwriting. For Emily. My heart nearly stopped. Samuel looked directly at me. Your father recorded this 6 months before he died. Tears instantly filled my eyes. A voice. After all these years. A real voice. Not photographs. Not letters. Not stories. Him. Samuel carefully placed the cassette into an old recorder sitting nearby. Then he pressed play. Static filled the room. A few seconds passed. Then a man's voice emerged from the speaker. Warm. Calm. Familiar in a way that made my chest ache. Hello, sweetheart. Tears rolled down my cheeks before he even spoke another word. The sound of my father's voice filled the farmhouse kitchen, and for a moment the entire world disappeared. Snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. The old recorder crackled softly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I closed my eyes and listened. Hello, sweetheart. The words carried warmth, kindness, and a calm confidence that immediately felt familiar. Not because I remembered it, because some part of me had always been searching for it. Tears streamed down my face as the recording continued. If you are hearing this, then there is a good chance I am no longer there to answer your questions. I am sorry for that. More than you will ever know. I pressed my hand against my mouth. Across the table, Samuel lowered his eyes. Damien remained completely silent. My father's voice continued. Life rarely gives us enough time, so I want to tell you what matters most. Not what I accomplished. Not what I owned. What matters is the people we choose to help along the way. The room felt impossibly still. Every word seemed to settle directly into my heart. You may discover things about me that surprise you. You may learn stories that sound larger than the man you thought I was. Do not let any of that change what you already know. I was happiest when I was your father. Tears blurred my vision. For years I had imagined what I might say if I could speak to him again. Yet hearing his voice now left me speechless. The recording continued. There is something else you deserve to know. I trusted very few people with your future. One of them was Samuel Bennett. The other was Damien Moretti. I slowly turned toward Damien. He looked down at the table. My father paused briefly before continuing. People will form opinions about Damien. Some will be fair. Some will not. But when I asked him for a promise, he gave it. And in all the years I knew him, he never broke his word. Damien closed his eyes for a moment. The weight of 15 years seemed visible on his face. Then the recording reached its final minutes. Emily, there is no hidden fortune waiting for you. No secret inheritance. The greatest gift I can leave behind is the truth. You come from people who believed kindness matters. You come from people who chose compassion even when nobody was watching. If you carry that forward, then every sacrifice was worth it. My throat tightened. The final words arrived softly. Do not spend your life searching for who I was. Spend it becoming who you are meant to be. I love you. Always. Then the tape ended. Silence filled the room. The recorder clicked softly before stopping completely. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, I wiped away my tears and looked at the photograph beside me. My father. My mother. A life filled with stories I never knew existed. Yet strangely, I no longer felt lost. The mystery that had haunted me since arriving at the estate had finally given way to something else. Understanding. Samuel smiled gently. He would be proud of you. I nodded slowly. For the first time, I believed that might be true. Later that evening, Damien and I stood outside the farmhouse beneath a pale winter sunset. Snow covered the fields in every direction. The air felt cold and clean. Peaceful. He trusted you, I said quietly. Damien looked toward the horizon. He changed my life. I thought about the pocket watch, the photographs, the letters, the recording. 15 years of hidden connections leading to this moment. And you kept your promise. Damien smiled faintly. I tried. We stood there in comfortable silence as the last light faded across the snow. My father had not left behind wealth. He had left behind something far greater. Lives touched. Promises kept. People who remembered him long after he was gone. As I looked toward the distant horizon, I finally understood the truth he had spent years protecting. Some people leave behind possessions. Others leave behind a legacy. And the strongest legacies are not built from power or money. They are built from kindness that continues long after the person is gone.